Now it's recording. Welcome to the Story of the Apprentice podcast. There's a little clip there. The story where we talk about the podcast where we talk about D&D storytelling. Tucker's journey into professional GMing and my also being a professional GM, but I've been doing it for a while. I've been doing it for over a year now. Um, I am one of the hosts, Jesse T. William, and with me, as always, is I can do the bit now,
Pinky Pinkyson.
Tinky Pinkyson.
That's fine.
Um,
That's
Tinky,
my legal name.
yeah, legal name.
You can look it
Um,
up.
Tinky, why are we here today?
We're here to talk about D&D. You already said it. You said it
I
this
will
time.
listen. Honestly, whenever I say why are we here today, I really don't know what I'm expecting. I just know I did it the first
I think it's become
time.
a staple that you ask
Yeah.
me that, and then I say to talk about D&D.
Yeah. Well, it started in the first, I was gonna say session, but the first episode. Um also don't mind my name change. In the first episode, Chinky Two Winkies. Um where Tinky Pinky Sin and Chinky Two Winkies, where it was a setup where I was like, why are we here today? And you're like, all right. And I was like, because we love each other. And really that is why we're here. It's not to talk about,
This is our excuse to hang out.
yeah,
This is our scheduled hangout.
this is it's well, scheduled is a loose word, isn't it? It's not like a
It's not
really,
even really that scheduled. It's
yeah.
like, do you have time today? And I'm like, oh, I have some time later. And you're like,
Yeah.
okay, we have 2 hours
Sick.
before one
Um
of us has to go do something.
the last episode we recorded about 8 hours ago, maybe nine, uh, before I had to run a 6 hour long crossover session. And now we're on the other side of that. And I still got some gas in the tank, you know?
Good.
So,
I just took a 6 hour nap, so
yeah.
I'm going.
So, fuck you. Um,
Pretty much the exact time that you were doing the crossover was the time that I was asleep.
no, wow, that's great. No, I'm happy for you. I'm really happy that you did that. I'm happy because I'm not
Yeah.
tired at all. I don't need sleep. Um, I get enough of that, certainly. Actually, I've been getting okay sleep. I'm not going to go off on a tangent about sleep. In the last episode, a couple of hours ago, we were talking about magic and world building and other things. And I mentioned what I mentioned. I mentioned something, and you're like, I have ideas. And
Well,
it's
it was because we
time.
were talking in general about
Mm,
the problems with 5e.
mm,
Copious amounts.
yeah,
And
yeah.
again, I say copious amounts. It's in that it's a system I like. I
Mhm.
wouldn't run it if I
It's
didn't.
yeah,
However, I take issue.
it's very functional. It like
Yeah, it
it
does its job.
yeah, it does its job. It's just like setting a because I think like how many years ago was it made? Like wait, 2014, 2013 when it
Yeah.
fifth edition. I'm taking a guess, could be a little older. But around that time, and things like Critical Role, Dimension 20, NADPOD, uh um the McElroy one, what's that one? Um
The Adventure Zone.
Adventure Zone. They weren't like super, they weren't like powerhouses like they are now. Um, so
They were around, like a few of them were around, but
yeah, I don't imagine that there was as much interest in the storytelling aspects of role playing games of TTRPGs. I don't imagine that that was the standard like it is now. Like a lot of with like robust storytelling and actual play shows that use D&D. And I'm sure like I obviously am very biased because my games are narrative focused and most of the players who come in have like a decent grasp of that. I know I was kind of complaining about like the worries I have about that and less, but like the majority of my players are whether they know it or not are like pretty decent at telling stories in a D&D context,
mm, mm.
given the restraints and whatnot. um but yeah, it's not designed for storytelling in that manner. It's a resource management game at its core, both in like the active daily resources and in like gathering gold and buying magic items and yada yada yada.
Mhm.
Um, so there are a bunch of flaws in the system that it's not really like meant to accommodate other things. It's also like super accessible. There's a million billion people who play D&D, and it's like the perfect gateway drug, right?
Mhm.
And instead of branching off from D&D and learning new systems, I'm just designing my own that works for what I want to do. That's what I'm doing. That's what I'm doing with my time and
Yeah.
resources. But anyways, I'm gonna shut up again. This is just a random tangent, but I'm now being more observant of it. I have one specific friend who I think I do this with more than other people because um we're both we it's not arguments, but it's just like like philosophical conversations. And I sometimes I will like I feel like she's slower to come around to understanding uh, um like the things I'm saying, and so she will start talking, and I think I know where she's going, and then I'll like re-explain what I'm saying based off of where I think she's going. And this wasn't pointed out to me directly, but also this is just a piece of IKEA. It's not a this
I was
thing.
like, what? I
I have
was
a
just thinking
random
about that.
Velcro. I just fidget. This is a Velcro white thing from something that was holding like, wires together. And
You
this is a
do
little,
frequently just pick up
yeah.
miscellaneous items.
Sometimes it used to be a Sokotan. Anyways, we're gonna circle back around on topic. Um, but so I was hanging out with people last night, and I did that. Uh, and another friend was like, "Let her finish," and I was like, "Oh wow." I really, and to be fair, she didn't say anything different than I was expecting her to say. But yeah, it's good to let people talk sometimes. And
Mhm.
I don't think I. Well, here's all. Oh, I'm overanalyzing myself. Um, uh, I very intentionally like you people who like watch the video podcast. Like when you start talking, I go back here
Yeah.
because I want to like bring myself away. But also like
Yeah.
some interruptions, like as long as you're like it's there's like a collaborative interruption, and there's
Mhm.
like I'm not listening interruption. I do
Oh yeah.
collaborative interruption. I feel like
There's a difference.
yeah.
I've actually, this is like something that I've actively taken note of, is like the different ways that people listen and interact. For example, uh, Brick, for those who know Brick, we are collaborative interrupters. Neither of us is allowed to finish a sentence ever. But it's very like welcome. We have a very
Mhm.
good like repertoire with each other, and it is pretty much always done with like the intentions of the collaboration, of adding to the conversation. And you're usually saying something in response to the other. Um, but however, I have noticed something, right? Because I have someone in my life who is so good at listening on a fundamental level that it's made me realize how bad everybody else is at listening. And not even in the sense of like being selfish, or like even people who are still considered like good listeners in comparison are bad listeners when you talk to him. Like there's just such a stark difference in the way that he listens to people. And I don't know how to tap into this. Like I've like observed him like an animal, because I'm like, oh, I want to be able to listen the way that he does, you know? Um, and it's just something like where he's so fully comprehending everything you're telling him, even if he knows nothing about it. He could know nothing, like have not even a base level of the information you're giving him, but he knows exactly what kind of questions to ask you about the thing that you're talking about that make you feel like, oh, he really understands, like at least on some level, what I'm communicating with him, and like the kind of questions that are going to make me excited to talk about a thing. And so sometimes I like to watch him when he has conversations with people, because I would love to tap into that one day, whatever special power he has of listening and of grasping what people are telling to him, and like knowing exactly like how to to further prod their brain and make them feel like, oh, that's such a like good question. And like now I can talk about it more and like and I can interact on like a higher level about this thing that you don't even know anything about. And so I just it's like something I've noticed like in talking to him has made me realize like everybody else in my life, even the people that I think are good listeners, are not that good compared to him. So most people just like on a base level are not like really good listeners. I don't know what it is about his personality or something within his childhood that has just like unlocked this ability for him to just listen and engage so well with somebody. Um, but he's got it. And it's just like so ever since like I met him, Elm, for those of you who know about Elm, because I know some people who listen do, and you do as well. But ever since I met him, I became very cognizant of like figuring out like the way that different people listen and the way that different people like communicate in like conversations and stuff like that. It's just like something I started to get really interested in observing in other people after meeting him, because like the way that he communicates, the way he listens is so different that it really sticks out when you meet him and makes you very aware of the way that everybody else like perform like engages in the social aspect of life. You know what I mean?
I yeah, no, I've definitely met people like that. I'm gonna circle this back into a D&D thing
Yeah, we gotta
at
we
some
the thing
point.
we're here to talk about.
Yeah, yeah, but because it like they obviously listening is a huge part of D&D, but I think
Yes.
there's also like a curiosity that goes with that,
Mm.
um, that some people have and some people don't.
Yeah.
Um, like I'm good at asking questions, and I'm like an insightful listener, I think, when I need to be. I have trouble engaging people maybe on like job stuff, because my experience with job stuff is like very like cafe. I I didn't even go to like a regular like university or college. Like I went to like a very like small college for a music program. So like my experience of like a lot of things that other people experience is different. I just lack context for asking
Mm.
certain questions. But I'm very good at when people have meaning in their lives. I can ask questions to get to that. But if
Mm.
people, I can't talk to like people who don't introspect a lot. So I'm good at finding those people. But I have someone in mind who has interacted a little bit similarly. But yeah, like on listening, um, that's like the eternal struggle as a DM. Is that like they're I'm gonna lightly roast a specific group, and they're a good group, but it's partially because there's elements in a D&D game. There's like degrees of degradation of information. So there's whatever people's capacity for listening is in the moment. There is um interpretation, and then there's like memory retention.
Mm.
So here's the setup. Um, in Philia, in the current situation, there are these divine emissaries, are popping up, beginning to pop up, and they're very powerful, and they need to be dealt with. And so the second most powerful party, and one of the players in this party listens to it, this podcast. So he'll maybe have fun with this. But one of the players or the characters or the parties, one of the parties, um, uh, asks some questions, finds out that there's potential of like that there's a god of lies, and also somewhere out there happens to be a god of truth. And Thalia's setting does not have a lot of context for um, gods outside of the pantheons they worship. They don't understand like their place in the world because they're cut off from it. They've never really, the people within the borders have never had a chance to venture out, and because of the way that the world works, in that you can't just sail from one country to another because there are all these rules to the world, like spiritual kind of rules to the world. They've remained cut off, And so they discover this like artifact of truth that um is like very it like can be used against um lies. And so um that's communicated like 6 7 sessions ago, and it's on the horizon, it gets brought up maybe one more time, um and then at some point I explain like the specific function of like this artifact is to be used against the divine emissaries. um uh you don't know exactly what because you're not around it yet, but it's like that is its function. And at some point, I don't remember the first confusion, but there was something some of the players said of like, oh, the artifacts for like this thing. And I was like, it's not. It's for the divine emissaries. The divine emissary, the biggest problem in the setting, the divine emissaries, it's for that. And then um cut to a bit later, and I'm describing like they get to the artifact and I'm describing what it is in more detail and what its function is. Um and what you call it. And then that session or in a session shortly after, a player again severely misunderstands what the point is or what the use of it is. And it's like this is a huge solution. This is crucial to the setting. And it's fun. It's again, it's fine if people misunderstand. It's just people being people. It's a very human thing
Mm-hmm.
to not retain complex information about a you know 8 campaign 150 some session um um narrative thing. You don't need to know. But it's also like I wish it wasn't that difficult, because then there's another thing of like the one character had the book, the artifact, in last session, and again one of the players was like, oh, are we gonna can we use it for this thing? And it was like, it has one use. It has a single use, a single intention of what you're going to use it for, and it can do that thing one time. You can't do it for a random thing. It's for the emissaries. Is it's kind of like, I know that there's some kind of like sword in Curse of Strahd, I think, like some sun sword that's like supposed to be,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
used for killing Strahd. It's kind of like if people are like, oh, so we use this to we throw it into a lake and a monster comes out. It's like, why sorry, back up. Where did the what did I say to get you confused? But it's just like
Mhm.
interpretation, uh like comprehension, interpretation, and then degradation. It's very normal, but it's just like I is someone like it's very hard for me, as someone who's maybe a little probably autistic, pretty sure, um uh to take myself out of my DM perspective, who understands everything perfectly. And most of the time, especially like as in the past like 2 months, I've been very cognizant of trying to explain things clearly so that people can understand them,
Mhm.
because they're big concepts.
I
There
think
are
we
these,
talked about at one point. I'm pretty sure we talked about this, but like the idea that when you are so familiar with the world you've created, it sometimes there's a disconnect between like, yeah, this makes perfect sense to me, that you don't realize that without certain contextual bits or that it is harder to like from an outside perspective, people who are just getting to know this world or don't know it as intimately, it is not as easy to grasp and might not make as much sense as you want it to because it makes perfect sense to you.
yeah,
You're so again intimately familiar with this world, and then like I think we talked about this when I started. Like I talked to you about like having to really think about like what information people needed that wouldn't overload them, but that would at least give them a base understanding of how things work. Um, and that is sometimes very hard. I wish my camera would figure out what it wants to do, but that is very hard to do when there is that disconnect
I
of
was
like,
trying to blur
being
myself. I'm sorry. Didn't work.
intimately like familiar with your world. And like and then that's kind of when I was like, well, I'm just going to like think about this world as if I were a regular person who exists in it.
I've come up. This is so auspicious
Mm-hmm.
because I've come up, and also if there's a change in my voice right now, it's because sometimes I speak with breath support and sometimes I don't. The way I naturally speak when I'm not thinking about it is um, not as like good, not bad for the voice, but it's like better. I get a better tone out of this, and like it'll improve my voice over time. And if I'm speaking for long periods of time, I should do this. Anyways, I've come up with two tools in like the past like week, and one of them um came from doing a puzzle. I love my puzzles. I love doing a good 1,000 piece puzzle. When we were talking before the first podcast today, I um I only have two puzzles left, 2,000 piece puzzle left that I can do. And I was feeling the itch. And so I went on Amazon and I was while we were in the middle of a conversation, I was just like, let me just look at some puzzles. I didn't get any because none of them were like fantasy enough for me. But
Mm-hmm.
anyways, in this puzzle, um, and this is like maybe this helps explain me just narrating what I saw in the puzzle, but you see um from inside an ice cave, you see like these like icicles hanging down, and you see a body of water kind of extend out, like a little river extend out into a valley, and you see this like mountain in the distance, and not all the way up the mountain, but like certainly not on the ground. You see on this like smaller peak a little like castle of some kind. And before you, before all of that, in this cave, there are crystals, and you see dwarves like actively hammering metal and like metalworking to create armor for a dragon that is just up the path. Um, and so the reason what I get from that, outside of it's a cool puzzle, it's a cool picture, but wondrous framing. So what is great about that picture or that depiction is the perspective of being inside the cave. I am in a cave and I'm centered in the cave and I'm looking out. And so that is part of my visual. I'm placing myself in a cave. So I know that intuitively about the picture now. And then it's a very like striking visual of like in the distance beneath these things, like it's like the way it presents is something that made me like rewired my brain or like gave me a new direction for narration, and using like canopies, like opening canopy, like the like when a tree line breaks, seeing through the frame of the tree line, what do I see? Or like from the perspective of a street, on the outside of an inn looking in, like I see the doorway and I see whatever outside of the inn, and I see the like warm hearth inside and these things, and just the little bits of information between, um having little bits of contrast like that, or even another perspective from the streets with particularly tall buildings being framed by like looming above in the distance of like above the like eye line. All those things, I think, both in the framing of it, place, at least I would hope, place players somewhere in the world that in some senses they intuitively understand, and um also for like more fantastical things like that, castle in the distance on the mountain. Or for example, I was thinking about a place called the Cloud Tower, which is like this. Well, I mean, let me even try to use this tool to like describe the Cloud Tower. So like walking in, so it's both a city and a structure. So walking into the Cloud Tower, the city, um, uh, there are these like very tight streets, with like close knit communities and very busy. There's a sense of being um, uh, on a like warm day, on a busy day. Um, sort of like the sense of like claustrophobia being around so many people, especially with the current events going on. There's maybe a few more people than should be here. Um, but looking above, and the buildings themselves are reasonably high. They like loom over and feel like you're walking through a maze. But even beyond the edge of the building, you can look up and you can see this very, very like thick and tall tower that has this like arcane scaffolding around the top that's still being built. And you can't tell how far away it is, because the scale of the object defies like a conventional understanding. It's big enough
Mm.
to just make it feel a little weird. And I've never experienced this personally, but I had a teacher in eighth grade talk about driving towards the Rockies and how every time he went over a hill, he thought he would get closer and he only felt farther away. It's kind of that kind of thing. Um, so anyways, that's what I call wondrous framing, where you
Mm.
try to create a like static image that gives you reference points for like the near and far and places you in the near in a palpable way. I don't know if in my head, I feel like, speaking of listening and communication, I feel like I communicated that super well. Does that does it resonate with you? Did you feel like you were on the streets of the Cloud Tower?
I felt like I was on the streets. I think it helps that I've heard about the cloud tower for so
Mhm.
long, but I've never actually explained, I think, in so much detail, at
Mhm.
least to our party directly, what the cloud tower is like. But I did have like a very really like specific image in my head about this tower.
Mhm.
Uh so yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
something I've also been trying to not necessarily get better about in my games because I feel like it's something I already do fairly well, but there's something I've tried to be very cognizant of. It's like explaining what a character is looking at, like from their perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I think it's because it's super easy to get, especially for me. I have a very like I'm picturing the forests of Ophelia right now, like the rainforest. For some reason, I was just placing myself there, but it's very easy for me to have such a, I don't want to sound pretentious, but such a comprehensive understanding of like a location in my mind's eye that rather than trying to really place the characters there, I just describe everything that's around. And when you just list off details, it's not a great way to communicate.
I find
Um,
that players will usually inquire anyway
yeah, that's true.
if they want to know what something looks like. Or like specifically. So I try there's like a general description of a place. The characters enter a place. I give a general description of it and the general vibes of the environment that they're in, which sometimes changes character to character based off of where they're from. It's like, okay, well, this character might feel this way about entering the space. This other character feels quite differently about
Yeah,
the vibes that are present. But I'll give them a general description. And then usually if they want more information of what it looks like, they'll ask. But I think that also comes from a disconnect and again, people's minds very different. I'm a maladaptive daydreamer at heart. I can I had this conversation with something recently, the apple conversation, where like if you picture an apple in your head, what do you see? And like I can picture an apple in my head and
See
like
it
the full
3D.
formed apple, like 3D. I can turn it around, you know
Mm-hmm.
what I mean? And so that's how I picture things. And some people it's like, well, I see an apple, but I'm not like it's not the details aren't quite there.
Yeah.
And some people just like don't have the apple. They're like, well, I know what an apple looks like, but I'm not like picturing an apple. And so there is sometimes like a level of disconnect.
Yeah.
And that's why with some players, if they and I'll kind of like be able to catch on to this with specific, like when a specific player asks me like, okay, well, what am I looking at? Okay, do I need to describe to them, like I can just kind of like be a little like I can flourish a little bit, you know what I mean? And I can really flavor text this, or is this the type of player who needs like specific details on like things that are in the room because there is a perhaps a disconnect from like the apple, you know what I
Mhm.
mean? And so I think that also changes things and sometimes parties are made up of more people on one end or the other.
Mhm.
And that is like kind of like a curve of like, okay, how does this party in specific like function and retain information? How do they interact with the world? Um, Based off of like what they are able to picture and how they can use their little imagination.
Um, the other thing that I was thinking about um is like grounding points or like points of contact for players of like what feels tangible. And I think I was even thinking I've like had this thought today or yesterday that I wrote down of like what can I say or what can I do in a game? What is something that can be understood amongst the group and be referenced that is tangible? So, for example, for party number one, and this it could like isn't just like, oh, we know what a table looks like, but like have a location or a thing or a part of the game that you establish quickly, and then you can move to different like new grounds. But like in every um place in the world that they go to, have something that uh grounds them in that reality, whether it be a well thought out NPC or a like very vivid place, something that they on some level understand the logistics of, and then you can reference things around that. And it's I think
Mhm.
it's sometimes it's locational, sometimes it's emotional. Um, there are times, and it's a thing that I've done by accident when I've done it. Like for the that's not even really true. I like not from a physical sense, but the themes that surround the story on the cloud tower. When we were talking about like David earlier in the last episode, I think the ground for that campaign for a long time was the story of what happened there and how those themes repeat and echo through. And um, now they've moved on. We kind of need new points of contact. But yeah, that was like my other main thing of like rather than doing it accidentally and just having things generally be vivid, have like the wondrous frame. It's like my pillars of narration that I kind of am like, that's what I called it in my little notebook. Like the wondrous framing of like placing the characters in both the near and the far, and then giving them something, or like their relevant position, and then giving them something that um outside of everything else feels like they can hold on to, and then like don't try to put other things in their hands. let them
Mm.
explore from that point. That's like their, whether it be a tavern or whatever, a person, whatever. That's the thing that they go back to be comfortable. Um, because it is very, because along with the things I said earlier, whatever they were, of like comprehension, interpretation, retention, um, there's also capacity. Like most players don't have the capacity, and I certainly don't as a DM, to explore every single like building and like understand
Mm.
the districts of a city, and like probably whatever it is can be infinitely complex. But I'm almost certain that the majority of the people don't care about how complex a thing is. It just needs to be,
Until somebody asks like a really ultra specific
yeah,
question, and you're like, why are you asking
like
that? I don't
tree
have the
plumbing.
fucking, it's like tree plumbing. It's always like a little bit like it's like a double-edged sword for me, is because I'm always like, oh, I think it's very adorable that you were interested enough in like a certain aspect of this world that you would feel the
Mhm.
need to ask. But also, why the fuck would you ask me that? I don't know. You're making me look stupid right now. I don't know. And that's that's how I feel when players ask me like really ultra specific questions about something like that, which to a certain extent, like with writing in any sense or form, you're going to become like really familiar with like really specific things.
Mhm.
Something that I learned like very quickly on, like quickly when I was like getting into writing like books and stuff like that, is how like super, because if there's things that I can keep vague, but then if I have to go into detail about it, I at least want it to be like semi-accurate. And so like how very like there are points in which I have like super ultra specific information about how something works. And then other times I'm like, I don't know.
I
I just straight up don't have an answer.
My whole world is based off of getting very tired. My head's beginning, that situation that happened during the, where I had to like really take control in this session. My head, I'm just feeling like a little weight. Anyways, we're gonna do at least an hour here. But what was I saying? What were you saying?
I was talking about like having very really specific knowledge about how certain things work, and then just completely being like, I have no fucking clue with other things.
My world is, I've mentioned this before, like heavily, it's a complex web of logistics. It's 3, 4, 5 years, less than that. It's like 4 years worth of
Mm.
logistics that have been built up over time. And here's how the gods work, and here's how this and that, and the secrets and whatever. Here are all the layers to this world that will, you know, produce or like imply other details about the world. So for the most part, when people ask me questions, I might not have thought of the answer yet, but most of the time, it's not difficult to
Yeah,
find the answer, discover the answer when applying the.
I can make some guesses based on the
Mhm.
way. I might not have like what exactly works like this, but I could be like, well, it would probably be this or this based on what I've gotten here and how this world works. And I can give at least some sort of answer. You know, there is on occasion where a player will ask me a really specific question about the way the world works, and they intend to use the information in such a way that does require me to make a decision right then and there about like how this works. And then I have to like after the session, I have to sit down and be like, okay, let me write some notes about how this thing works. So I can kind of retain some consistency when this ultimately comes up later, because this character has intentions to use that information for something. Because sometimes, especially when you consider that like certain players have experiences outside of my own in sometimes very practical things, and that because I don't have that experience, I wouldn't think to utilize it. Um, I'm trying to think of an example for this. but one's not coming to mind. But just something, a way that I wouldn't think to to solve a problem or interact with a problem or something like that, because I just don't have an experience with one thing or another, as much as like they do. And they are kind of like, well, this is how it works in like the real life, and like, you know what I mean? And so I
Yeah.
do have to kind of come up with an answer in order for them to kind of utilize this thing. And because I didn't have that experience, I wouldn't have thought to interact with my world in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that happens on occasion. But usually it's fairly like harmless and innocuous, like the weird specific question that they're asking,
Mm-hmm.
because human beings are funny and curious.
I I've noticed that a lot of people know about, especially Americans, know about like military stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and in a world that where I don't know shit about battles, I a year ago, I was getting really into watching some documentaries about like history and cultures and people. But there's a little bit of stuff about battles, and I took a little bit of inspiration here and there. Um, but also, this is a world with magic, and so I have to account for magic in the battles. Like there's a very cool scene that is in the middle of happening in one of my Friday games with Thomas, who we mentioned last episode as well. That was I'm not gonna get into it, but that was the moment where, and then I'm getting into it, where he made the like character choice to like run away. Um, but so there's this concept that I've like talked about a little bit on TikTok, and people really took to it about in my world about what happens when too many spells are cast at once. I mentioned last episode that the fundamental state of things, in the same way that in the real world it's atoms, in my world it's magic. Everything's magic. And so when a spell is cast, it is just reshaping what happens to be there, or affecting what happens to be there through like everything being magic. And so when a bunch of spells are cast in the same place, you get what is called a clinch. And in a clinch in a large scale, it becomes one kind of mass of magic and will. And in a battle context, most contexts, you have uh, the kind of like frontline warriors in the center of this clinch, taking a shit ton of damage and a shit ton of healing at the same time. And there's really not a whole lot that those warriors can do other than survive and come out the other side and then attack the casters once everyone's magic is like mostly used up. And the clinch, again, like it's just a really, really palpable magic overload. So it either heals or destroys, and so it will like fuck up a like anything that it's in its way. If a tree happens to be there, the tree will sink in and disappear and just be obliterated. Or like grass, whatever it is. Buildings, if that happens to be the case. I've never contextualized it in that, but I want to put a battle with a clinch in a city now. But in this battle, they're dealing mostly with a force of devils, of specifically what are called colloquially crystalline hatred, or the actual like technical term is just crystalline devils. And um, they don't have wings, but they're very good climbers. Um, so in Folia, they often go through the branches and the canopies and like descend upon people. But you had a situation where you had this army of elves who are also very dexterous, and like some of them do tree shit. And so they set up the situation where there was a line on the ground and a line in the trees. And the crystalline hatred are coming forward, and a bunch of spells are being cast very intelligently en masse, like create or destroy water. was like cast a shit ton of times. They just create like a like block of water to like wash these crystalline hatred out of the trees. And then I had the side create a clinch, but like create it kind of at an angle, with only for like a couple of seconds, with the intention of cutting off the bottoms of the trees where all the crystalline heat were coming through, so that they would like fall over and then create this space. First of all, like a big hazard with a bunch of trees falling everywhere, against other trees and whatnot, but then create a big space where the crystalline hatred had to go on the ground. And now the elves have this tree advantage. And of course, that wouldn't last forever because eventually they'll just go around. But in the heat of the battle, felt very cool. But like that is all just fun little magic logistics that I thought of for my battles. And I don't know if it probably makes sense. It sounds like it makes sense, but I'm sure I'm terrified to I really want to speak to like a um like battle historian and tell them about my magic battles and how they use magic in battles and be validated. But I'm also terrified of someone being like, that's a stupid strategy. They should have done this, and be like,
Be
that's
like, actually, that's not how that works. Shut up. It's
actually
made
it's
up. If
magic,
I
so
said
fuck
it works
you.
like that, it works like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is a mindset that as a DM I stick to.
Mm-hmm.
Is I make the rules. Fuck you.
Yeah, how about shut the fuck up?
I would be quiet. No one talk. Um, although there are a lot of very interesting um resources. That's the word. Um,
Words are hard sometimes.
words are very hard. That are like available from like the amount of like works that have been put together like for the specific purposes of writers looking to write something specific is very impressive online. However, if anybody ever looked at if somebody got murdered around me, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And then they looked at my search history, I'm going to jail. They'd be like, well, he did it. um, but there are a lot of like really good resources like about um and that doesn't mean like again you're no expert, so there's always like a sense of like it could technically work another way, but there's always something that out there that like if I want more information about it, at least for the sake of inspiration, I can gain access to it, um which is very useful. um but I understand like for example whenever I create something, I love to homebrew races.
Oh,
um
love homebrew races.
yeah, homebrew, that's my favorite activity.
I in a
I don't
big
like to homebrew classes. I'm not actually a big fan of that because I'm not crunchy.
fucking
You know what I
loser.
mean? I know. I just don't like to do it.
I'm a
I
big
don't
crunchy
fucking
boy.
care. I'm not a bit.
I have
Well,
like
okay, I can
I
be a big
have
crunchy boy,
5
but
homebrew classes available on my Patreon. So
there you
think about that.
go. I think they're neat. I like reading homebrew classes. I love collecting them. I have a player in my Thursday game who's been playing D&D for a long time. It's like the 80s, 90s. And he like came in with like, hey, like look at all this stuff, you know? And I was like, oh, fucking sick. And it's just a bunch of homebrew classes and all sorts of homebrew stuff. But I'm more of like a homebrew race kind of guy. But I have
Mhm.
a Elm actually, where we were speaking of earlier, very, very knowledgeable on like the evolutionary purposes of like traits within animals and humans. And so when I tell him about something, he goes, he'll immediately have a bunch of questions about like, well, how does this work and why did it happen? And I'm like, I'm fucking magic. Fuck you.
Yeah. That's
But
my
it's helpful at times though to kind of have somebody who
Mhm.
is like, well, have you considered like that it might have formed because like this happened and back in the day, this is the situation that they were in and the environment, their habitat, and so it formed this way. So it can be very helpful, but sometimes I'm like, shut up.
Mhm.
Shut up. Stop asking me so many questions. I think
in
it's cool. That's
yeah,
why.
in my world, um so many homebrew races. I'm filling it up with homebrew races because in my head, if you're gonna have elves, orcs, dwarves, halflings, humans, gnomes, whatever, why stop there?
Yeah.
Get
There's so much
weird
more you
with
can
it.
do. Get
There's
weird with it.
let me count up
Yes.
the homebrew races that I've conceptualized for Savannah. Let's see. There are one, two, um, three, four, five, six, kind of seven, but it's a kind of elves. There's two kinds of elves that I could include. They're not among the regular races of elves. Um, uh, so what's that? Sorry, let me count the regular ones. I'm not gonna. Anyways, I was at like seven or something. Eight, nine, 10, 11, 11, 11 just homebrew races. For the seven lands of Savannah, and I think that's pretty neat. Um, I can't be fucked to stat them though. I don't
Oh
care.
yeah. Fuck
Variant human. Shut the fuck up. You know what I'm
them.
saying? Um, but also, so on the topic of evolution, so as mentioned, so I love science. I don't like space.
Science.
Space is scary. Love evolution. I love genetic stuff. Very cool to me. Um, Richard Dawkins is a little freak. He's a little weird guy. He has some issues, but he's written some pretty interesting works on genetics and stuff, and I used to be interested in it. Don't have the brain capacity for it anymore to read stuff that dense. Um,
That's
love
why you
that
have to
stuff.
get a little creature
Yeah.
who's really hyper fixated on that kind of thing. And then you can just be like, hey, what do you think about this? You just gotta collect little creatures with really specific hyperfixations.
So I love all that stuff. I'm even I'm like agnostic. I don't pretty sure if there is a God out there, it's not any of the ones we think about. That's just my personal opinion. I don't really care what other people think. I really am interested in engaging with people who have faith in different ways, especially when they're good people. I come from a background where people in faith were not great and really didn't have any strong attachments to it, or the right kind of attachments to it. Um, very not spiritual, not anything, very scientifically minded. Love me some science. Not in my fucking fantasy world. All of the races were placed in wherever they are now in a general area at the dawn of time, all at the same time. They were just there. They didn't fucking evolve. That I don't want to accommodate that much goddamn history. That happened depending on the campaign I'm running, 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. All of the races just appeared and then they developed some languages and shit. And Bob's your goddamn uncle. You have a big old fantasy world. Um,
Mm-hmm.
don't fucking ask me about evolution, how things evolved. Things didn't evolve in this fucking world. They were made, they were created. They, you know, um, so anyways,
I
that
tend
is
to work it in somehow.
mm,
Because as much as I have like a little shithead who loves to ask about it, I'm also thinking about it a lot of the time. Um, I think it comes partially to do with my like significant interest in sci-fi. I'd love to run something sci-fi. I just like not fucking gonna use 5e for that. You know what I mean? Or at least it's
mhm.
gonna look very different if I am. But I do really love sci-fi. Um, and I love mostly because I like stupid sci-fi shit. I like nonsensical stuff. Like I really enjoyed Dune, not because I thought Dune was that good. I just loved all like the dumb bullshit. I love all the stupid ass like what are you even fucking talking about? You know what I mean? I really like when sci-fi is like very stupid and
I also
fantastical, but
I just want to say this. I
mhm,
saw Dune in IMAX.
mhm,
It was fucking incredible. Um, it's
I
a bit
bet
long. I did have
it
things to do that
yeah.
day, and towards the end of it, I was pulling up my phone and and being like, "Is what time is it?"
The crazy thing about Dune, we're gonna do a Dune tangent. Me and Brick watched it for the first time together like last week.
Hmm.
We loved it because again we're the same guy and we love dumb fantasy. So we'd look at each other and be like, "Oh my god, what is that?" We had so many questions at the end. We're like, "I would see the second movie. I have so many questions. What are they talking about? What do they mean?" And it made us both also look at each other and go, "We could be so much more ridiculous with our world building. Like we could just get really fucking wild with it because that's what they did." And I we love when things like kind of don't make sense and like just kind of get silly with it. And that being said, I also like really comprehensive sci-fi as well. We watched The Arrival pretty much like immediately
Hmm.
after, which is a lot more like cohesive. Even though it does contain like fantastical elements, it's a lot more cohesive. And we enjoy that just as much. But it's here's the thing is that I looked at the time of Dune and it's long, but it's not like that much longer than any regular movie. But there's something about watching Dune that feels like
It's well,
a
it's
really long time.
the pacing of it, because the direction it's going is like the things that they're setting up are realistically like 4, 5, 6 hours into the story, but the movie ends in like 2.5 hours or something, or like more or less. I don't know. I don't remember. But it's like the movie ends and they're about to go to a new place and they've just introduced Zendaya's character.
When we saw his like vision of Zendaya's character, Brooke looked at me and was like, "We're not going to see her until the very end of the movie.
Mm.
We're going to get like 20 minutes of screen time, maybe, of her. Like I can tell by the way that they're setting this up that it's just not going to fucking happen." I liked Timothy Chalamet more than I thought I would. It was the first movie I ever saw him in, and I liked his character more than I thought I would. Oscar Isaac's also in the movie, which is always a plus for me.
Love him. Love that
I
guy.
have like an unreasonable. I don't like do celebrity crushes very like I don't. I'm not that kind of person. Oscar Isaac is the fucking exception. I'm unreasonably invested in this man and everything he does. Um,
I hold
but
no idols.
I'd shut the fuck up. Look at him.
I'm
He's a
not so
fucking
weak.
perfect man.
Listen, he's
Uh,
he's charismatic.
it's
You
the
know, he's a little haughty.
he is a little
I don't
haughty.
care. I don't care.
He
You
is a
know,
little haughty. He's so good. I love every I okay, in all fairness, I like formed as a teenager. I was going through like a particularly hard time in my life, and I discovered that he used to make music.
hmm
And while I was going through a particularly hard time in my life, I listened to his music a lot.
hmm
And I think that formed like the parasocial relationship at that point had been linked. And now I'll just watch whatever he's in just because he's in it. Doesn't really matter if I care
I
about
feel
the
like
genre.
Oscar Isaac would be a very good D&D player because he seems
Not
like a
because I
decent guy.
just love him, but uh, I do. Um, uh, but the point beside, I love sci-fi. I would love to do something that I have like a world built with sci-fi. I have a lot of really crazy ass races with sci-fi, but it's also because I really like both the fantastical and the um more grounded parts of sci-fi. Um, and so I am thinking about like if I'm making a race from another planet, I don't just like, okay, well, this is what they look like because I think it's cool. It is because I think it's cool, but I'm also thinking about like what conditions were they under, like planetary wise atmosphere that caused these things to develop and evolve so much differently than like life as we know it. Elm was a great resource for that because I could like kind of walk up to him and be like, talk to him about it. And he would immediately have like, oh well, I mean, if you're considering this, and this is because Elm is really interested in prehistoric stuff, really interested in dinosaurs, but also like prehistoric mammals and all that kind of stuff. He can name every. You could show him some weird ass prehistoric thing. He can immediately tell you what exactly it's called and what period it was around in and how it functioned. You know what I mean? So he's very useful for stuff like that. So I am kind of thinking about it. But Brick and I, when we were talking about something we've been writing for a while in a fantasy world that we had created. And I've moved some of the races that exist here into my homebrew and like into D&D, because I think they're fun to play with and I can utilize it. And it's something that has happened for me a lot is that because I already write outside of it, I've pulled NPCs, magic systems, gods, stuff like that from other things I've created, because why do the work a second time? Why do it all over again? Now, some things are completely new. They just don't function in this world well. And so I have to just come up with something new. But if it, so I have a cool concept that already functions, can be functional within this world, I'm going to move it over. But we're talking about that and like the nature of like how things came to be, how things were created, evolution, gods, creationism, you know what I mean, etc., etc. And I brought it around to something my dad told me when I was young. And here's the thing: there is flaws within the what I'm about to say. It opened up a whole new like line of questions for me as a child. I grew up in a very Christian household. They did not believe in evolution. Very much creationist, very like staunch evangelical Christians. Um, and so I was raised to believe that evolution was not real. And it didn't exist that way. And I remember one time there was like this a argument that atheists generally use to poke holes in Christianity. And I'm not a Christian. Um, there's a lot of complications with me when it comes to like how I feel about the religion I was raised with, and there's a lot of trauma there as well. Um, however, I have a big bone to pick with a lot of atheists who are very staunchly against religion, is that they use their worst arguments. And I'm a very big believer that if you're going to make an argument about something, you only use your best argument ever. You devalue the rest of the argument you're making when you start bringing up things that are not relevant or easily deconstructible. Um, but something that they say a lot when they're trying to like kind of tear down the Abrahamic religions, is like, well, if God is all powerful, you know, he like could theoretically create something more powerful than him, but nothing is more powerful than God. So you know what I mean? So they're like, it's the loophole, it counteracts himself. So God couldn't be real because it doesn't work like that. Really bad argument to make for a lot of reasons. But I remember when I was very young, I was like maybe 12, 13. I had a conversation with my dad about this, who is a much more not like my mom's side, which is very conservative Christian, very Republican. This side of my family is more left. And many, not all of them are Christians. My dad's a Christian, but he was not raised with Christianity. His mother and his father are not Christians. Like his siblings are not Christians. So he still kind of retains a lot of his leftist ideals. But I asked him about this, and he said to me, you know, this is a controversial take, and I think that a lot of Christians would, you know, crucify me for this kind of take. But I believe that there are fundamental rules of the universe that even God cannot break. There are certain things that even he like it just doesn't work like that. That there's something, not a thing higher than him, but just like the way that things work, fundamental rules of the universe, which like as a child, I took that and was like, there's like so many different ways, like from just like a conversation standpoint and like speculating, like if you wanted to run with that line of thinking, that like you could take that and you could really get like kind of crunchy with the way that that works or how it would theoretically work. But it was such an interesting concept. It was something that like no other Christian in my life had ever even considered. You know what I mean? That I was immediately like really intrigued, and it stuck with me well into adulthood. And so sometimes it's something that I like to kind of play with when I'm doing worlds in which gods do exist. You know, I have a some pretty like staple Tucker themes within anything fantasy that I write. Is that the term God is like super relative. And the way that like we as a human think of like a Christian God and what like classifies an entity in a fantasy world as a god is are like two very different things, you know? Um and that's not something that's necessarily new to fantasy as a whole. It's something that Dragon Age does a lot. But it's just something like I had a conversation with Brick when we were talking about that aspect of like world building and like how gods function, how the world was created, where these races come from, what it means to be in a position of godliness or to be a god or to be some kind of entity of higher being. And I brought this I like mentioned this concept, the story, the same story to Brick. And Brick kind of was also immediately, so we have similar brains, intrigued by this thought process and was like, okay, well, what does that mean for like how the world was created? You know, when there are certain and so that's something we've run with a lot in our own world building, and something I've run with a lot in um my own world building. So for the people who watch this or play my games, maybe you might be able to utilize knowing this information about me. Is that the way that I think about gods is that even they are at there are specific limitations, I guess, within the universe that just do not allow for like specific actions to be taken. But it also puts me in a place where magic and science can very much exist within the same world, but not just like on a because there's a lot of like things that I've read in the world building where they don't really address the fact that science and magic exist within the same world, which is something that like is really present in my mind because of my upbringing. Because of going to school and having arguments with kids as we are learning about evolution, because I've been brainwashed and am telling them like, well, it just doesn't exist, and school is lying to us. I've had a lot of arguments from as young as like the third grade up, before I kind of like fell out of faith, and like about the nitty gritty of like what that means. And I remember I did have like a teacher in the fifth grade who told me like, well, theoretically they could exist in the same world, but so many Christians and so many atheists who really believe in science are so one cannot exist if the other exists, which I think is so interesting. And so it's a concept that I really like to play with, and I like to include it um, in my storytelling and in my world building, the idea of both of them coexisting and what that looks like specifically and how both of them can affect each other. I have a homebrew race that both evolved magically and scientifically from a single creature and gained sentience. And I've thought a lot about how logistically which parts of like a magical element of evolution and just straight up like scientific evolution has affected what they are now thousands of years later versus what they originally were. And it's very like I guess kind of like dense and like you could go all sorts of directions with it. Not like what's the word I'm looking for? So many people could interpret that in like such a different way and be like, well, you're wrong. I think it would go like this. But it's fun. It's fun for me. I have fun doing really stupid, crunchy shit like that. And so I
Sorry, I'm
think about
allergic
those
to
things a
dork. I
lot.
just had to sneeze there.
Shut the fuck up. Shut your little mouth.
I felt the sneeze coming and I was like, wait for it. Sorry, continue.
No, but you're right. This ultimately boils down to I'm a huge dork and I have a lot of fun thinking about all like the two dorky things from the different like sides of being a dork, of like the really scientific aspects of it and then the really like silly little magical aspects of it. And I like intertwining them together, and I like seeing how they work together, and I like trying to figure out how they would work together. And I would contribute that to a lot of like my upbringing, and like the way certain things were explained to me as a child, making me like, oh, that's so interesting.
For the simplicity of my logistics, because I feel like having taken 11th grade chemistry, physics, and biology, um, in Canada. I don't know how it is in the States, but in Canada, I took those courses. And
These are pretty regular
yeah,
courses to take. Like
I would
I
imagine.
didn't, would drop out. I
Hmm.
don't know shit.
Um, but I know too much about that stuff to be able to be like, iron is an element in my world. No, the fuck it's not. I don't hate, but I I I don't like when people come into my world and are like assume science.
Mm.
It's
I
because from a logistical standpoint, for me personally, um, uh, you can't have, or I guess I mean you could like try to figure it out, but like if to me if it's not going to work like it does in the real world, it's going to work completely differently. And I like taking ideas, like metallurgy and ideas from chemistry and alloys and things, but putting a spin on them. So for example, one of my favorite aspects of my world building from a very, very like granular kind of perspective is the idea of how metallurgy works and how elements work of like things there is no like process by which you learn how things are created or how things end up in the state they are. They just are. Some things just are. And so when you learn how to transform one thing into another thing, if you do not uh, um, tell people or write it down or share that information, there is a slim goddamn chance that someone else will be able to turn that one thing into that other thing ever again. And so with the history of like lost metals in my world, not lost metals, but lost recipes for metals, um, that's part of the world building because there's no reverse engineering because it's not chemistry. You can't break it down into elements, um, uh, especially with like how the lands work and the memories of the lands and things like that. When a and even sorry, a bunch of thoughts at once that just went on top of each other. Um, like an object. So, for example, a there's a metal around this region of the world, the Sumatra, Samea subcontinents, um, called Crest. And Crest was made by the people of Valais, which was one of the civilizations that got wiped off the map when the world flooded from the elemental plane of water. And um, Crest is this like heavy gold like substance that it's lighter than gold, but it's still heavy. Um, that's very good at like naturally kind of dispels magic. Um, uh, and even if you cast a spell to like learn about the history of like, oh, I have this Crest spear, how did it come to be? You would get the actions taken with the spear and not the creation. Because the spear, also being a metal, the like magical insights you get from it are its meaning.
Mhm.
That's just the way the world works. So there's no reverse engineering. Um,
Mhm.
I was gonna say another thing, maybe about races. It was generally along the lines of like the crossover between science and magic, and that there isn't fucking any. But you got me
I
thinking about.
do.
So go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say I do think that to a certain extent, like I understand though. I still understand the dislike of assumption of science, especially because even though I work with science and like a lot of my world building, there is like areas where, due to the nature of magic, certain things that should work a certain way simply fucking don't. And that is ultimately up to me and how I think it works, just based on my own brain. Um, however, I do understand that feeling because even though I do that, um, I had an instance recently where somebody went, "Well, this should work like this," uh, and there was like a an energy about the way that they said it that made me like, stop. Don't you make no assumptions. uh, uh, I didn't take it. I don't take it that personally. I like
Mhm.
this player. However, there was like a element for me of like at the end of the day, this is still all silly made up shit. And so it works the way I think it should work in my brain. And as long as I'm relatively consistent, it's how it fucking goes.
So
Don't question
that's
me too much.
with the tree plumbing thing mentioned specifically. Because there is this one of the cities in Philea is a city that is built on the branches of trees, a city, a big city, and it's made out of
Mm.
wood. And they're like, how's plumbing work? It's fucking hate these goddamn players. They listen to this podcast, so that's why I'm saying that. I'm doing a bit for
He's gonna
them.
be so excited.
He's
He's
gonna
been
be
wanting
so
this to get
yeah.
brought up for so long. He's
They
like, please
mentioned
talk about
yeah.
trees.
Um, and like and they mentioned about how um like trees pull water from from their roots or something and do a
Mm.
grow. And it's like, no, no, they don't.
In fact, because you
Trees,
said that.
trees grow with the spirit of the land. And they just kind of go upwards from the
Mm.
base. They get bigger at the base, not the top. Um,
However, I don't blame players necessarily right off the bat when they make assumptions
no,
like about
no, no.
because there is a certain element of like, yeah, they understand they have like these certain understandings in the world and how they're going to orient themselves when interacting with something they don't know is to find something they do know. You know
Yeah,
what I mean?
yeah.
That's totally normal. However, when you bring it up, I am going to go, no, it actually doesn't work like that
Hmm.
because I decided it doesn't.
Hmm. This is a world where a big chunk of the forest, the rainforest that was claimed by the elves, all of the trees or all of the leaves in the trees turned red, and all of the wood on the inside slowly turning a shade of blue. And the bark will eventually turn a shade of like kind of like orangish gray or like bluish gray
Might be
because
annoying.
an
And
archfey decided that it was going to do that.
I
What? Say something annoying.
no,
See,
I was
test
just
me,
gonna say
sucker. Say it.
I was just
What do you
gonna
want to
say
say?
like so does that mean like because I don't think I've ever asked you really like what like when we're in a city, I'm never like, hey, what are the buildings here made of?
Mm. It
Is the
depends.
lumber like is it when buildings are made of wood,
So
what does that look like once it's
the
let me
most
ask you a really hyper specific question
yeah
about your world.
most buildings in Philea were made before that happened.
Oh, okay.
Because that happened in the last like 50 or so years. That happened after the fall of
Okay.
the Soviet Empire. Um, but as time progresses and planks in buildings get replaced or
Yeah.
reconstructed, they do eventually take on the blue tint. They're replaced with blue,
Mm.
you know. And so I actually have somewhere a little tavern piece I made, or like a little like it's a cardboard with a layer of uh, um blue stained like blue wash like mini wash stained
Mm.
popsicle sticks to show like the, and it looks really nice, it looks really good, I'm quite happy with it. um but yeah, so like there are, because at the end of the Folia campaign, all of Folia will have red canopies. That
Mm.
will signify the nameless red arch, and it's going to happen in a couple of weeks. Nameless red archfey claiming this domain under its protection, and um, and then over time the woods will change as well in their color. Um, but yeah, that answers the question. It'll the so over time, as like over the next 1,000 years or so, eventually all those planks will be replaced. I think Azal,
They will be blue.
yeah, I think Azel being a wooden city, and given what happened to it, I like the idea of Azel never being rebuilt and being kind of like a ruin, and lost to time a bit, um, given all the history that it has and the complexity of it, and it really being a relic of a like pre-Semitic time. But anyways, this has been the Story of the Apprentice podcast. This podcast where we talk about D&D and storytelling and world building and stuff. I am your host, very tired. And
No, you have
uh
to say it.
Jinky T Winkies, very tired TM. And this is, I feel like my headphones have like compressed my head, and that's what's anyways. Um
That's why I don't like big headphones.
yeah,
I
that's
end up
fair.
feeling like I'm being crushed. Like
Yeah.
there's too much pressure.
These are like good quality like audio professional. I'm gonna shut up. And
I
my
also had an
host,
earwig in one, so
yeah, I hate that.
it was really bad.
And my host,
Pinky Pinky Sim.
Tinky Pinky said, um uh um uh